Megyn Kelly thought she could trap Jasmine Crockett with gotcha questions and aggressive interruptions in what was supposed to be a friendly interview. What happened next broke the internet and ended Kelly's comeback attempt before it even started. The Sirius XM studios in Manhattan felt unusually tense that Tuesday afternoon, despite the familiar setup that had hosted hundreds of political interviews over the years. Megyn Kelly sat across from her producer's desk reviewing her notes one final time before what she'd privately called her comeback interview. The conversation that would remind people why she'd once been considered the most formidable interviewer in cable news. After her departure from Fox News and the failure of her NBC morning show, Kelly had been working to rebuild her media empire through her Sirius XM show and podcast. She'd been looking for the right moment, the right guest, the right controversy to catapult her back into the national conversation. When Representative Jasmine Crockett agreed to appear on her show to discuss her latest legislative initiatives, Kelly saw her opportunity. Representative Crockett sat in the guest chair wearing a burgundy blazer and carrying her signature leather portfolio. She'd agreed to the interview reluctantly. Her staff had warned her about Kelly's reputation for ambush journalism, but Crockett believed in engaging with media across the political spectrum, even when the hosts were potentially hostile. What Crockett didn't know was that Kelly had spent the past week preparing what she called a full takedown, a systematic attack designed to expose what Kelly saw as Crockett's radical agenda in media manipulation. Kelly's research team had compiled opposition research controversial quotes taken out of context and a series of rapid-fire questions designed to make Crockett look unprepared and extreme. As the red recording light blinked on, Kelly launched into her introduction with the polished confidence that had once made her a cable news star. I'm Megyn Kelly, and today we're joined by Representative Jasmine Crockett, the Texas Democrat, who's been making headlines with her confrontational style and progressive agenda. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. Thank you for having me, Megyn, Crockett replied calmly. Kelly wasted no time getting to what she thought would be her first gotcha moment. Let's start with something that's been bothering a lot of Americans. You've been very critical of law enforcement. You've defended criminals as a public defender, and now you're pushing policies that many see as anti-police. How do you reconcile that with public safety? It was a loaded question packed with false premises and designed to put Crockett on the defensive immediately. Kelly's plan was to interrupt any nuanced response and push Crockett into sound bites that could be used against her. But Crockett had faced this kind of questioning before, and she was ready. Megyn, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in your question that we should clear up. Crockett began, her voice steady and professional. Being a public defender isn't about defending criminals. It's about defending the Constitution, specifically the Sixth Amendment's guarantee that every person accused of a crime has the right to competent legal representation. Kelly tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued smoothly. I'm curious, do you believe in the presumption of innocence? Do you believe that people accused of crimes deserve legal representation? Because if you do, then you support the work that public defenders do every day. Kelly's confident expression flickered for just a moment. This wasn't the defensive response she'd expected. Well, of course, but good work, Crockett said, not allowing the interruption. Then we agree that the constitutional right to counsel is fundamental to American justice. Now, regarding your characterization of my policies as anti-police, can you point to a specific policy proposal I've made that you consider anti-police? Kelly shuffled through her notes looking for the talking points her team had prepared. You've supported defunding the police. Actually, I haven't, Crockett interrupted gently. I've never used that phrase, and I've never supported defunding police departments. I have supported reallocating some police responsibilities to social workers and mental health professionals for situations they're better equipped to handle. But that's not defunding. That's smart resource allocation. She leaned forward slightly. Megyn, before we continue, I have to ask, did you or your team actually research my policy positions, or are you working from talking points someone else prepared? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kelly's face reddened slightly. She was supposed to be the one asking tough questions, not answering them. I've done my research, Kelly said defensively, and what I've found is a pattern of radical positions that are out of step with mainstream America. Such as, Crockett asked calmly. Kelly looked down at her notes again. You've supported reparations for slavery. I've supported studying reparations, Crockett corrected. There's a difference between supporting a study and supporting a specific policy outcome. The study would examine the economic impact of slavery and discrimination to determine what, if any, remedies might be appropriate. She tilted her head slightly. Are you opposed to studying the economic impact of historical injustices? Megyn Kelly was starting to look flustered. Her rapid-fire attack strategy was being methodically dismantled by someone who actually knew the details of her own positions. You've also supported Medicare for all? Kelly continued, trying to regain momentum. I've supported expanding access to health care, Crockett replied. Medicare for all is one option, but I've also supported public options, expanded ACA subsidies, and other approaches. The goal is ensuring that Americans don't go bankrupt because they get sick. She looked directly at Kelly. What's your position on healthcare, Megyn? Do you think Americans should have to choose between medical treatment and financial stability? Kelly was now visibly uncomfortable. She'd expected to be grilling Crockett about controversial positions, not defending her own views on basic policy questions. I think we need market-based solutions, Kelly said weakly. Interesting, Crockett replied. Can you give me an example of a market-based solution that would help a diabetic who can't afford insulin? Kelly stared at her clearly, having no specific answer prepared. Because I can tell you about Maria Gonzalez in my district, Crockett continued. She's 34, works 2 jobs, neither of which provides health insurance. She's been rationing her insulin because she can't afford the $300 monthly cost. Last month, she ended up in the emergency room in diabetic ketoacidosis because she'd been skipping doses. Her voice took on more intensity. Now Maria's ER visit cost $15,000, which she can't pay, so the hospital will write it off as charity care and pass the cost on to other patients and taxpayers. Meanwhile, the insulin that could have prevented the crisis costs pennies to manufacture. She looked directly at Kelly. So I'm genuinely curious. What market-based solution would you propose for Maria? Kelly opened her mouth, then closed it, and she had no answer because she'd never thought beyond the talking points. Let me help you out, Crockett continued. There isn't a market-based solution for Maria because she doesn't have market power. She needs insulin to live, so she has no choice but to pay whatever price is demanded. That's not a market. That's extortion. The studio was completely silent, except for the hum of recording equipment. This is the problem with a lot of political commentary today. Crockett said, her voice taking on a teaching tone. People throw around phrases like market-based solutions and radical agenda without actually understanding what they mean or how they apply to real people's lives. She opened her portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Megyn, I brought something I thought you might find interesting. It's a list of policy positions that poll above 60% support among American voters, including Republican voters. She began reading. Allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices, 83% support. Expanding background checks for gun purchases, 89% support. Raising the minimum wage to $50 an hour, 62% support. Providing paid family leave, 74% support. She looked up at Kelly. These are all positions I've supported, and they're all mainstream American positions. So when you call my agenda radical, what you're really saying is that the majority of Americans hold radical views. Kelly tried to interrupt, but Crockett wasn't finished. Or maybe what you're saying is that you're so disconnected from ordinary Americans' experiences that policies designed to help working families seem radical to you. She leaned back in her chair. Which brings me to a question I've been wanting to ask you, Megyn. When's the last time you worried about paying for prescription medication? When's the last time you had to choose between taking your child to the doctor and paying rent? Kelly's face was now noticeably red. My personal financial situation isn't relevant. It's completely relevant, Crockett interrupted, because you're sitting here calling policies that would help struggling families radical while you've never had to experience the problems those policies are designed to solve. She pulled out her phone and showed the screen to Kelly. This is your Wikipedia page, Megyn. It says your current net worth is estimated at $45 million. You have a $17 million contract with SiriusXM. You live in a $7 million house in Connecticut. Kelly looked like she wanted to crawl under the desk. So when you dismiss policies designed to help people afford healthcare or housing or education, you're not speaking from experience, Crockett continued. You're speaking from privilege. And there's nothing wrong with being successful, but there is something wrong with using that success to attack policies that would help people who weren't as fortunate. Him. She closed her portfolio and looked directly at Kelly. This is why your interview strategy isn't working, Megyn. You came in here with talking points and gotcha questions, but you don't actually understand the issues you're asking about. You thought you could trap me with loaded questions, but you can't trap someone who actually knows what they're talking about. The silence that followed was deafening. Kelly sat frozen, clearly having no idea how to respond to someone who just systematically dismantled not just her questions, but her entire approach to journalism. I think we should wrap up here, Kelly finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Actually, I'd like to say one more thing, Crockett said, looking directly into the camera. To the people listening to this interview, this is what happens when media figures try to substitute performance for preparation, when they confuse aggression with journalism. She stood up and began removing her microphone. Megyn, Kelly invited me here not to have a conversation about policy, but to try to make me look bad with gotcha questions and false premises. But when you actually know your subject matter, when you've actually lived the experiences you're talking about, those tactics don't work. She looked back at Kelly, who was still sitting in stunned silence. I hope this has been educational, Megyn. Maybe next time you'll do your homework before trying to interview someone who's actually done theirs. And with that, she walked out of the studio. The interview had been live streaming on SiriusXM's platform, and clips were already being shared across social media before Crockett had even left the building. Within an hour, Crockett destroys, Kelly was trending on Twitter. The moment when she'd asked Kelly about market-based solutions for diabetics was being shared millions of times. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Political commentators called it the most thorough dismantling of a media figure they'd ever seen. Journalism professors began using it as an example of how not to conduct interviews. Even conservative commentators admitted that Kelly had been completely outclassed. But the real impact was on Kelly's attempted comeback. Within 48 hours, 3 major guests had canceled upcoming appearances on her show. SiriusXM executives were reportedly reconsidering her contract renewal. The interview that was supposed to reestablish her credibility had instead exposed her as unprepared and out of touch. The contrast between the two women couldn't have been starker. Crockett's calm expertise had made Kelly's aggressive questioning look amateurish and desperate. Her substantive policy knowledge had exposed Kelly's reliance on talking points and superficial research. Media critics began analyzing the interview as a perfect example of how traditional gotcha journalism fails when confronted by someone who actually understands the issues. The old model of interrupting, attacking, and sensationalizing looked outdated when compared to Crockett's approach of answering questions thoroughly and turning the conversation towards substance. 6 months later, Kelly's show was quietly canceled, her comeback attempt having failed spectacularly. The interview with Crockett had become a viral sensation, but not in the way Kelly had hoped. Instead of rehabilitating her image, it had cemented her reputation as someone who'd been left behind by a changing media landscape. Crockett, meanwhile, saw her national profile continue to rise. The interview had showcased not just her policy expertise, but her ability to handle hostile media with grace and intelligence. Political strategists from both parties began studying her approach as a model for how to deal with aggressive interviewers. In her first interview after Kelly's show was canceled, Crockett was asked what she'd hoped to accomplish in that confrontation. I wanted to show people what happens when preparation meets performance, she said. Megyn, Kelly thought she could rely on old-school gotcha tactics, but those don't work when you're interviewing someone who actually knows their subject matter. She paused. I also wanted to demonstrate that you don't have to accept false premises or loaded questions. When an interviewer tries to trap you with misleading framing, you can reframe the conversation around facts and substance. The interviewer asked if she felt bad about ending Kelly's comeback attempt. I didn't end Megyn Kelly's career, Crockett replied. She ended it herself by coming unprepared to interview someone who was prepared. That's not my fault. That's just accountability. The lesson was clear. In an age of social media and instant fact-checking, traditional gotcha journalism can backfire spectacularly when it encounters real expertise. And when someone with actual knowledge confronts someone who's been coasting on reputation and performance, the truth has a way of exposing the difference in real time. Megyn Kelly thought she could corner Jasmine Crockett with aggressive questioning and loaded premises, reviving her career by making a rising political star look unprepared and radical. Instead, she exposed herself as someone who'd confused performance with journalism, privilege with perspective, and talking points with actual knowledge. The interview that was supposed to break the internet by destroying Crockett instead broke Kelly's career by showing millions of viewers what happens when manufactured controversy meets authentic expertise. And in the process, it became a perfect example of how accountability works in the modern media landscape, where preparation beats performance, substance beats sensationalism, and real knowledge always triumphs over carefully constructed mythology.